In this lesson, we will look at a slightly more complex human workflow scenario. We'll model the approval of an expense report. Instead of sending the whole expense report to one person or group to approve, our requirement this time around is to send the expense report header to one group, the header approvers group, and then each line should be sent for approval to another group, the line approvers group, in parallel. Let's look at a specific instance of an expense report. So I want to send this part, which is the header, to one group called the header approvers group, and I want to send each expense line. I've got 3 expense lines here. I want to send each expense line to another group for approval. That's the line approvers group. So basically I want 4 task instances created in parallel. 1 for the header and 1 for each expense line. Let's see how to set this up in our human task now. Before we look at how we have set up the assignment, let's look at how we have set up the data. So as usual, we have set up the expense report as the human task payload element. Let's look at the details. Because we want to model the approval of each expense line, I've selected use collections. I call the collection expense lines, and let's look at the detail. It points to the expense line element. Let's go back into our assignment now. Because we want the header and lines to be approved in parallel, I've created 2 stages here, one for the header and one for the lines. Let's look at the stage configuration. So for the header, I have the normal default non-repeating stage. Let's look at the line approval stage. I want to send each expense line for approval, so I have the repeat stage in parallel for each item in collection. And I've selected the expense lines collection from my data that we've set up before. Because each expense line would be sent for approval in parallel, I have to set up how the voting works for the approval outcome. So the way I have set it up is that unless all expense lines are approved, unless 100% of expense lines are approved, the outcome will be a reject. Let's look at the participant types. So it's a single type and it's assigned to the header approver group. And for the line approval, again it's a single type and it's assigned to the line approver group. Finally, I have voting set up for the outcomes that come back from the 2 stages, the line approval and the header approval. And again, unless all of the lines and the header are approved, the outcome is going to be a reject. Now that we've looked at how the human task is configured, let's take a look at how the ADF task flow is configured for this human task. Now, typically when I create the ADF task flow for the expense report human task, I just have one page in there which shows the expense report and the user can approve or reject the whole report. In this case though, we have 2 stages in our human task, the header approval stage and the line approval stage. So what we want here is that the header approver should see only the header part and each of the line approvers should see the specific expense line that they are approving. To do this, I have created the respective JSPs for the header and line viewing. The entry point to my task flow is a method call activity that routes to the header JSP or the line JSP depending on the human task instance that this task flow is invoked from. If it's invoked from a task instance in the line approval stage, it will get routed to the line JSP. and if it's invoked from a task instance in the header approval stage, it will get routed to the header JSP. To make that method the entry point in the task flow, I have to make it a default activity. To make the determination whether it's a header or a line, I have to read a system attribute that gets passed into the task flow from the human task. To read this attribute, I've created a page definition for the method, and I have a binding in that page definition. I'll just drop in another method here just to show you how I did that. Create page definition, bindings, attribute values, identify your human task, and look for system attributes and choose system attributes. And the specific attribute that you're looking for is called stage. I just created this method to demonstrate how I did that, so I don't need it. I'm going to delete it. If I go to the page definition here, you'll see the same thing. I then created a managed bean. I read the stage attribute in a method in this bean, and that's the method that I call in my method activity. The method returns a string for header or line, and based on that, I go to the header JSP or the line JSP. Let's take a quick look at the method code. So I'm reading the stage attribute that we created in our page definition. If the value is line approval, I return a line or I return header. Let's look at the JSPs now. Let's look at the header JSP. What I've done here is I've just dropped the task action for the menu. And then I dropped the expense report header as a form. Similarly for the line JSP, I dropped the task actions and I dropped the expense line as a form. When we run this, there will be a task for approving each expense line. To display the appropriate expense line out of a collection of lines in this form, we have to read another system attribute. We have to read the collection target index. So just like we added the binding for the stage attribute, I've added a binding for the target index attribute on this page. If I go to the page definition, you can see the target index attribute. This is a binding I specifically added, just like I added the stage binding. I had to write some ADF code that executes on page load that makes sure that I'm displaying the expense line as the target index from the expense lines collection in the payload. To execute that code on page load, I'm calling a backing bean method in the before phase. Let's look at that method. This method could be called multiple times by the JSF lifecycle, but I want it executed only once, so I'm maintaining a flag for that. I'm reading the target index. I'm also finding the expense line iterator, which is in my page bindings. Let's quickly take a look at that. I have expense line iterator in my page. And then I just iterate through it until I reach the target index value and set the current row. Let me quickly demonstrate how the tasks come up as in BPM workspace. I'm going to submit an expense report. I have 3 expense lines in this report. So let's submit this. In BPM workspace, when we log in as the header approver, we see the header form. This is the header stage, header approval stage. We approve it. If I log in as line approver, I see 3 tasks, one for each of the expense lines. We had 3 expense lines. If I click on each one of them, I'll see which line it is. This is the meal, this is cab, and this is airfare. Now I'm going to approve 2 of them and reject 1. If I log into Fusion Middleware Control and look at the outcome from the human task, then I'll see a reject. It's because that's how our voting has been configured. Unless all the lines and the header is approved, we're going to have a reject.